Hello friends, my name's Ty and I'm going to read to you. And I'm reading to you tonight from a new chair that doesn't squeak. So I'm pretty excited. Tonight's selection is a short story that I wrote a number of years ago called The Coffin Was Cold. Here we go. Colin put his hand on the smooth wooden surface and looked at the framed picture of his friend. He didn't know exactly what he had expected, but he was somehow surprised to find the coffin was cold to the touch. He had not yet cried over Sean's death, but as he stood there with his hand on the cold surface of the box, feeling there really was no life, no warmth, a tear broke and rolled down his cheek. He looked over his shoulder. James, with his heavy, square beard and his heavy, square shoulders, stood directly behind him. James's eyes were set intently on the toes of his shoes, and Colin could see that several tears had made the journey from James's eyes to the ends of his beard. Behind James, Mason and Matthew, who was never Matt, stood shoulder to shoulder, their heads hanging. They were not related by blood, but were so similar in their slender, narrow-faced appearance that they might have passed for brothers. The years since the close days of their youth had taken them hundreds of miles away from each other. Only Sean and James had stayed in Vernon, the town where they all grew up. But once a year, they all returned and their friendship was renewed. Only this year, their reunion was forced upon them, and one of them was missing. Sean, who had always been the light patch in their hard lives, was gone, and there was a cold space where he was supposed to be standing. Then. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Colin asked, as he looked doubtfully through the viewfinder of the massive, clunking video camera that Sean had borrowed from the high school drama club. "No," Mason and Matthew said in unison. "It'll be fine," Sean said from where he stood on the roof of his house. "The table will break my fall." Colin focused the camera on the table, a ramshackle piece of furniture Sean had gotten at a garage sale for $1, and he didn't like it would support an empty paper cup, let alone to break the fall of a heavy kid who had aspirations on being a wrestling superstar. "What are you doing?" Colin asked Mason, who was holding the portable phone from Sean's kitchen. "Getting ready to call an ambulance for when he breaks his neck?" "Good idea," Colin said, and focused the camera on Sean's smiling face. "Are you sure about this?" James asked, adjusting the executioner's mask Sean had convinced him to wear. "Yeah," Sean said, slapping both shoulders vigorously. "Do it." Sighing, James gave him a shove. "Now." "How are you holding up?" James asked Colin, as the latter stared at the tops of his clasped hands. The church was empty now, except for the four of them sitting together in one pew near the back. Colin shrugged. He paused, sniffed loudly to stave off the tears that wanted to come, and cleared his throat. "I'm getting by." He lifted his head and met James's eyes, and looked past him, past Mason and Matthew. "This is hard." Colin's friends knew that he had found Sean, that he had called a local RCMP detachment, but they did not know that Sean had lain in his grubby little apartment for at least a week before Colin had used a spare key he'd gotten from Sean's mother to get in. They also didn't know why Colin had made the journey from Vancouver to see Sean in the first place. Colin had been sitting in his living room, after a day shift as a patrol sergeant with the Surrey RCMP, when his phone rang. "Hello," he said when he picked it up, but was greeted only with silence. He was about to hang up when he heard a voice, Sean's voice, say his name. "Colin?" He recognized the voice instantly, having heard it every day from the time he was 2 till he was 20. "Sean?" he said, a feeling of guilt gripping him. He had not spoken to Sean in months. So absorbed had he been with his recent promotion and all the things that came with it. "How are you, man? You have a bad connection. It sounds like you're far away." There was more silence on the line, and Colin thought the call had dropped when he heard very faintly, "Colin, I'm sorry," and then nothing. He looked down at his phone and it was black. He checked his call log and it showed no recent calls. He tried Sean's phone, but it went unanswered and the mailbox was full. A cold feeling gripped Colin, and it kept its hold as he got off the couch, packed an overnight bag, and drove to Vernon. When he arrived at the door to Sean's shitty apartment, his mother's spare key in hand, he knew instantly what he would find when he got inside. After more than a decade as a street cop, he knew the smell of a dead body, and the hallway outside Sean's unit was thick with it. When he opened the door, he was assaulted with both the stench of decay and the thick cloud of flies. His experience took over, and he compelled his feet forward, even though his heart broke with every step. Sean was in his bed, or the inflatable mattress on the floor of the small bedroom that he had been using to sleep on. And when Colin saw him, he had to clap a hand over his mouth to stop the cry that burbled up his throat. The body was bloated, the torso darkly purple and distended, while the hands and fingers were shriveled and pale, like they had been soaked in water too long. The remains of a foam cone, the telltale signs of a drug overdose, circled the open mouth. Where Sean's clear blue eyes had once been was nothing but gaping sockets, and in the depths of those sockets a white mass of maggots wriggled. The body was there, ripe and rotting, but whatever had made Colin's friend who he was long gone. He turned and fled the small, filthy apartment, hurrying away before the scream he was holding in escaped. It was only hours later, as he sat in his truck, watching the coroner and the body removal team haul the corpse away. Sean had been dead a week, maybe more, but Colin had heard his voice on the phone less than 10 hours before. The thought, even still, gave him a chill, and he shivered in the church pew. "Were you able to figure out what the official cause of death was?" Mason asked. Colin nodded and looked at his hands. They all knew what the answer was going to be, but he spoke it out loud anyway. "It was a drug overdose." "I thought he'd gone to rehab," James said, his baritone voice rumbling from the depths of his beard. "He did," Mason and Matthew said in unison. "He must have relapsed," Colin said, and felt stupid the moment the words left his mouth. Of course he had relapsed. That's how people in recovery died of drug overdoses. He had been a cop long enough to know how these things happened, but what he wanted to know was why. "I want to know why this happened," Colin said, speaking his thoughts aloud. "I talked to Sean after he got out of rehab, and he was doing well. He had a job, was back in the gym, and was talking about joining a little wrestling company that had seen his demos and was interested. He had everything going in the right direction. I don't think he did this on his own." "What are you saying?" Matthew asked. "Do you think Sean was murdered?" Colin shrugged. "I'm not saying someone put the needle in his arm, but I think someone put it in his hand. And I want to know who that was." "And then what?" James asked, his rumbling voice cracking as fresh tears leaked into his beard. "And then I'm going to talk to that person," Colin said, and see what they have to say. They were all silent for several minutes, each of them struggling with their own thoughts, wrestling with their memories. "Sean always stood up for us," Colin said, as one particular memory stung him. "I think it's time we stood up for him." "Don't look at the dance floor," Colin shouted into James and Colin's ear over the thumping music hammering out of the Tower nightclub speakers. Of course, Colin looked. "That bitch," he said when he witnessed the spectacle James had hoped to spare him from. Mason and Matthew, standing on the other side of the small round table they occupied, both slapped their hands against their narrow faces. In the center of the dance floor, Colin's ex-girlfriend, Christine, was grinding her crotch against the leg of a tall, slender, undeniably good-looking guy that Colin recognized from several of his university courses. "I thought she said she needed some time alone," Colin said, raising his voice to be heard over the music. "When did you guys break up?" James asked, as Christine grabbed the good-looking guy's head and began making out with him. Colin looked at his watch. "About 4 hours ago." "That bitch," Mason and Matthew said in unison. "What do you look so pissed about?" Sean asked as he set 2 large plastic pitchers of beer on the table. "Dance floor," James said, jerking his thumb over his shoulder. Sean stood on his tiptoes and frowned. "That bitch," he said. "Exactly," Mason and Matthew said together. Sean quirked his mouth in a thoughtful expression, then picked up one of the pitchers and, without aid of a glass, drained half of it off. "Wait here. I'll be back." He slipped, extremely nimbly for a man of his girth, through the crowd, and Colin saw him appear behind Christine and her new friend. "Hey! Christine!" Sean shouted. He had a voice that was at least as expansive as his gut, and every head in the bar turned towards him. Christine took her tongue out of the good-looking guy's mouth and looked at Sean with a sneer. "What?" "It's herpes!" Sean shouted. "What?" Christine asked again, her sneer turning to a look of profound concern. "That bump! On my dick!" Sean shouted, now the complete nexus of attention in the building. "You know, that bump that matches the one you have?" Sean pointed towards Christine's recently grinding crotch. "Well, I had it tested and it's herpes." The doctor said there are pills we can take, but you have to go and see him yourself. He wouldn't give your dose to me." There was a collected intake of breath as everyone in the building gasped. Then laughter erupted. The good-looking guy began wiping at his leg and fled through the crowd, while Christine spun in a circle, a horrified expression on her face, and she saw dozens of people laughing heartily at her expense. "No," she said, "he's lying." But she could barely be heard over the gales of hilarity, and it was entirely possible no one would have believed her even if they could. Sean, wearing a deeply satisfied smile, returned to the table, picked up the half-empty beer jug, and gulped down the rest of it. "Let's get out of here," he said, when he set the jug down with a thump and tilted Colin a heavy wink. "I believe my work is done. Now." "What are we doing here?" James asked as he leaned forward and looked up through the windshield of his pickup at the front of the rundown apartment complex. "We're going to ask some questions," Colin said, and opened the passenger door. In the back seat, Mason and Matthew looked at each other. "I think this is a bad idea," Matthew said. "Really bad," Mason said, nodding. "They're right," James said, and put a hand on Colin's arm. "I think we should leave this alone. It's not going to help." Moving his arm from under James's hand, Colin shrugged. "I'm not going to do anything. I just want to talk to a couple of the neighbors, see if they notice anything strange." Without waiting for further comment, he slipped off the seat of the truck and slammed the door behind him. 5 steps away from the big vehicle, he heard the other doors open. "But you were already here," James said as he hurried to catch up. Colin said nothing for several steps. "I wasn't really thinking then," was all he could come up with. The tenant listings at the front of the complex had a buzzer number for the building manager, and Colin rang it. He had given back Sean's key when he went to tell Sean's mother that her son was dead. He should have hung on to it, but when he thought of how long it had been since he last talked to his friend, he didn't feel he deserved to have it. There was no answer, and Colin rang the buzzer again. When the call was answered by a gravelly, annoyed voice, Colin explained who they were and said they were there to pick up a few things from Sean's apartment for the family. Several minutes later, a hunched, leathery old man appeared at the open door. The man was of average height, but appeared diminutive due to the dramatic curve in his spine, although the wild strands of hair sticking up straight off his liver-spotted scalp gave him the illusion of more height. "What you say you wanted?" the manager said as he opened the door and let them into the lobby. He was busily puffing on a wrinkled cigarette, and Colin looked from him to a neon green no smoking sign pasted by the front door. The man looked in the direction of Colin's gaze, grimaced, and blew out a long plume of smoke into the air above Colin's head. "We just wanted to get into Sean's apartment and grab a couple of things for the family." "Sean?" the manager asked, and took another drag from his battered cigarette. "That the fat guy?" Short jets of smoke shot out of the man's mouth as he spoke, and Mason and Matthew waved their hands in front of their faces in a vain attempt to ward off the cloud. "Yeah," Colin said, and took a deep breath. His nerves were already frayed, and he was on the verge of losing his temper. Sean was the heavy guy. He died recently. "Overdose," the manager said, and took another drag. "Yeah," Colin said, sticking the hands in the pockets of his slacks. The manager shrugged and started walking down the hallway, pulling a ring of keys from the pocket of his dirty jeans. "You can go in there if you want. It stinks something awful, though, and the cleaning crew ain't due till Monday." "Why does it stink?" James asked. The manager stopped and turned, one eye squinting as smoke from the cigarette stuck in the corner of his mouth drifted up around his face. "Why does it stink? 'Cause the fat guy laid in there for a week before someone found him. He was pretty ripe, you know." Colin's final nerves snapped, and he lifted his hand, reaching for the old man. James, who was standing between Colin and the manager, intercepted the hand and yanked it down before any harm was done. "No, we didn't know," James said, his words clipped and brisk. "Thanks for telling us." The manager shrugged again and turned down the hallway. When the old man was a few steps away, James, who was still holding onto Colin's wrist, pulled him close. "This was your idea, Colin." Their faces were so close that Colin could feel stray hairs from James's beard tickling his chin. "This was your idea, so don't fuck it up now that we're here." James was right, Colin knew, and he nodded. "Yeah. Okay." Apparently satisfied, James released him and hurried after the old man. Mason and Matthew flanked Colin and placed a hand on either shoulder. Together, they followed James. Sean's apartment was a short walk down the hallway at the rear corner of the building. "Here it is," the old man said, fitting a brass key into the lock and turning it. "The stink is too much for me, so I'm going back to my place. Buzz me when you're done and I'll lock the door." He withdrew the key and turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and anything you don't take now is going in the dumpster on Monday. Just so you know." Colin opened his mouth to speak and felt James' broad hand squeeze his shoulder. He shut his mouth with a click and took a deep breath. "Okay, thanks." The old man slipped his key ring back into his pocket and turned down the hallway. "Are you sure you want to do this?" James asked as Colin reached towards the doorknob. "Yes," Colin said, although it was a lie. He didn't really want to do this, but he felt compelled to. He looked at the door and realized it was only the second time he'd ever been there. He knew the block of apartments because they'd been a fixture in town when he lived there, and he'd had to get Sean's mother to tell him the unit number. For however long Sean had lived in this place, struggling with whatever demons haunted him, Colin had never darkened his doorway. He hadn't called to see how Sean was doing. He hadn't even sent him a text to say hello. After all the times Sean had come through for him, Colin hadn't even tried to come through for Sean. Then. Colin looked down at the hastily scrawled notes he made after the phone conversation he'd had with the RCMP recruiter earlier in the day and rubbed his hand across his forehead for the 10th time in the last 2 minutes. They'd had a recruit drop out of a training class and was set to start in the autumn at a depot in Regina and offer the spot to Colin, conditional on him attending a final suitability interview at the E Division headquarters the next morning. "So, what are you going to do?" James asked from his side of the table. It was from the other side of Colin's parents' battered kitchen table. "I don't know," Colin said and rubbed his forehead again. "I don't think I can make it." "How long will the flight take?" "Only a couple of hours. I could get on a flight tomorrow morning and make it in plenty of time for the interview, but the flight will be almost $500 and I just don't have it." He'd asked his parents for a loan, but they were strapped even tighter than he was, and borrowing his old man's run-down truck was out of the question, even if the old beast would make the long drive. "I wish I could help you, man," James said, rubbing at his short beard he'd been working on for a couple of weeks. "But I'm tapped too." Sitting back in his chair, Colin pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "I think I'm screwed." He sat up as he heard a vigorous pounding on the door. When he answered it, he saw Sean on the porch, Mason and Matthew on either side of him. "Why are you just standing there looking ridiculous?" Sean asked. "Get your shit together." "What shit?" Colin asked. "The shit you need for your interview. We gotta get on the road." "I don't think I'm going, man. I don't have any wheels." Sean jerked his thumb towards the driveway in the front of the house. "I talked my old man into letting me borrow his car. I've got 2 cases of Red Bull and a bag of beef jerky. You sleep, and we'll drive." He twirled his fingers to indicate himself, James, and the Almost twins. "We can all throw in for gas money and have change left over to get celebratory chicken nuggets when you ace this thing." Colin could only stare, open-mouthed. Sean clapped his heavy hands together. "Come on, man, this is important. It's your future we're talking about. And if we're going to make it, we got to go." Suppressing the urge to cry, Colin wrapped Sean in a brief, tight hug, then ran to get his thrift store suit and a shaving kit. Now, the inside of Sean's tiny apartment resembled nothing so much as a garbage dump, with special punctuation on the smell. "Sweet Jesus," Mason said, gripping his nose. Mimicking the gesture, Matthew looked like he was fighting the urge to gag. "Oh, that's disgusting." "How did he let it get this bad?" James asked, making no move to cover his face but wrinkling his nose. Colin wanted to tell his friends that the smell was better now than the last time he was there, but he thought it better to keep that particular piece of information to himself. "What are we looking for?" James asked, as he gripped his beard and peered down on the floor. "Anything that will give us an indication of what happened to Sean," Colin said. "Don't we know that already?" James asked. "Anything that will tell us why it happened, then." Mason and Matthew went into the little kitchen, the sink brimming with brackish water, the counter covered in restaurant wrappers and bits of moldering food. James stalked, still holding his beard, in the living room. Colin, stepping over piles of trash, went into the bedroom. The bedroom was much as he had last seen it, only without the cadaver on the air mattress looking half deflated, like a forgotten party balloon. The cheap dresser with ragged corners and a tilting nightstand were the only other furnishings in the room. The nightstand was covered in small square bags and uncapped syringes. Colin bent down to examine the bags and saw the lightest dusting of blue powder in the corners. Fentanyl, he muttered to himself. The lower mainland was lousy with the stuff, killing users by the hundreds, but he hadn't suspected it had made it this far north. He glanced over at the stained sheet on the air mattress. He also hadn't suspected Sean would be using it. He was bending to open the top drawer of the rickety dresser when he heard a heavy, exhaled breath behind him. The sound was filled with regret and longing, close enough that he felt the breeze of it on the back of his neck. He turned, thinking to see James or one of the twins, but there was nothing. He rubbed the back of his neck, where the hairs all stood on end, and glanced out into the short hallway. He was alone. "Anything in there?" James asked in the living room. Casting another look around the room, making sure he was alone, Colin cleared his throat. "No, nothing." "This is weird," Matthew said from the kitchen. "Really weird," Mason said. Colin stepped out of the bedroom, pulling the door closed behind him so none of his friends could see the stained sheet on the mattress. "What did you find?" "It looks like a pay stub," Matthew said, his voice nasally because he was still holding his nose. "But it doesn't have Sean's name on it," Mason said, holding out a slim piece of paper. Taking the paper and looking at the name, Colin ground his teeth together so hard they creaked. "God damn it," he said, his jaw tight. "What?" James asked. Colin showed him the name. "Tim Kenyon?" James said, pulling his chin back so his beard spread across his chest. "The loser we went to high school with?" "Yeah," Colin nodded. He was Sean's dealer before his first stint in rehab. He crumpled the piece of paper. "This is a stub for a welfare check, and it's dated 2 days after the approximate date of Sean's death." "What's that mean?" Mason and Matthew said in unison. "It means Kenyon was in this apartment after Sean died, and probably sold him the drugs that killed him. Then." "I don't know, dude," Colin said, looking over Sean's shoulder at the new arrival of the party. "I don't think you should be hanging out with him." Sean turned to look at Tim Kenyon, who was smiling easily and talking with several other people James had invited to his parents' tiny house for Colin's going-away party. "Pfft," Sean said and waved a meaty hand in a dismissive gesture. "He's good shit. And he brought beer." "Isn't he a bit of a burnout?" Colin asked. "I heard he sells a lot of weed." "Dude, don't be ridiculous. I said he brought beer." "You know where I'm going tomorrow, right?" Colin asked, his patience beginning to slip. Sean was well past the point of drunk, as he was so often lately. Since his dad had died of a heart attack 6 weeks before, Sean seemed to spend all of his time drinking and arguing with his mother. Tonight he'd killed at least half a case and was turning into a pain in the ass, which he usually did, drunk or sober. "You're going to be a man of the law," Sean shouted, as he raised a full beer bottle. "And I'm damn proud of you, too." He began draining the bottle in noisy gulps. "Do you think it's a good idea to have a drug dealer at a going-away party for his guy who's on his way to the police academy?" Sean lowered the bottle, now empty, and sat it with a clunk on an end table beside the ragged couch that took up most of the living room. "It's all good, man. I told you, he's good shit. And he brought beer." He reached in his back pocket and produced another brown bottle, beads of condensation running down the neck. As he twisted the top off, he tilted Colin a wink, then called out a greeting to someone elsewhere in the house, and was gone. "What was that about?" James asked as he stepped up beside Colin. "Sean brought Tim Kenyon to this little soiree," Colin said, crossing his arms. "Is that a problem?" James asked. "You want me to give him the toss?" "I don't like that Sean is rolling with him," Colin said. "I have a sinking feeling it's going to turn out bad." "Now, this is a really bad idea," James said, as he jogged down the filthy alley to keep up with Colin's furious stride. Colin ignored him. A red mist had descended on his vision, and he was past the point of reason. Someone was going to answer for Sean's death, and now he knew who it was. "How do you even know he'll be here?" Matthew asked. "He probably won't be," Mason said. Colin stopped at the alley as the alley emptied into a narrow roadway between two businesses. It was well after dark, and the sidewalks were mostly deserted, and it was easy for him to pick out the person he was looking for. "You know what they say about old habits," he said, and turned to his right and walked briskly towards the lone figure standing at the edge of a circle of light cast by a street lamp. He was a little thinner, a little rougher on the edges, but Tim Kenyon looked much as Colin remembered him. He was even standing in the same corner he used when he was selling weed in high school. He was looking down at the bright screen of a smartphone and didn't look up until Colin was a dozen steps away from him. "Hey, man," Tim said, pocketing the phone. "What you need?" As Colin stepped into the pool of light, Tim's eyes widened. He opened his mouth to speak, then turned and tried to run. Colin took 2 big, quick, lunging steps and shoved Tim with both hands, sending him crashing to the brick wall behind him. The air went out of him with a little yelp, and he slumped to the ground. Colin crouched over Tim and seized a handful of his filthy coat, pinning him down as he cocked his right hand over his shoulder. He knew he shouldn't, but Colin felt himself smiling. Before he could smash his fist into Tim's rolling head, James caught up to him and hooked his big hand to the crook of Colin's elbow. "Colin, stop," James said. "No," Colin said, not taking his eyes off Tim's face. "He killed Sean, and he's going to pay for it." "Please," Tim said, his eyes clearing as he stared upwards, his face white with terror. "Please, I didn't know he was going to take so much. I didn't mean to hurt him." James leaned forward, his face next to Colin's. "You think about Sean," he said, his voice low. "You think about whether he would want you to do this. Then." "Oh, Jesus," Colin said and took another sip from his beer. "What?" James asked from where he leaned against the railing of the front porch. "It's her," Colin said, and jerked his chin towards the street. "Oh, Jesus," James said and turned around, covering his face with his hand. Clicking up the driveway in her high heels was Christine, a slim, pretty man following in her wake. "What the fuck, Colin?" she yelled, as she got close enough to recognize him. "You were going to leave without even telling me?" Matthew and Mason looked at each other from their battered lawn chairs, sitting a little further down the porch. "Is she serious?" they asked in unison. "You broke up with me 6 months ago, Christine," Colin said, turning for the door of the house. "You don't deserve a goodbye." "Don't you walk away from me," she said. Colin ignored her and reached for the door handle. "Hey, fuckface," Christine's companion yelled. "Get your ass down here and apologize for turning your back to the lady." His hand above the door handle, Colin stopped and turned to James. "You know, I would never hit her, but I could live with hitting him." He turned and put his hand on the railing to leap over, when something snagged his belt and pulled him back. "Settle down there, Trigger," Sean said, as he released his hold on Colin's belt and took a long pull from another beer. "What's going on?" He stood on his toes and looked over Colin's shoulder. "Oh, it's her again." "I said get over here and apologize," the slender man said, pointing at the ground in front of him as though he were addressing a naughty puppy. "And she brought a friend," Sean said. "Don't you ignore me," the slender man said, stalking across the front lawn, Christine right behind him, to stand arm's length away on the other side of the railing. "Get out here now." Colin moved to leap the rail again, his temper flailing. But Sean stepped in front of him, blocking Colin with his bulk. "It's time for you to go," he said. He was addressing Christine, but he was staring hard at her companion. "Fuck you, Sean," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Not taking his eyes off the pretty man, Sean pointed his finger at Christine. "You need to leave, now, or something terrible is going to happen." She cocked one hip out and crossed her arms. "I said I'm not—" Whatever she was going to say was cut off by a shriek, as Sean reached out with one meaty hand, grabbed hold of the pretty companion's shirt, and headbutted him in the face. Everyone stared silently at the fallen form of the slender man, except for Sean, who noisily slurped his beer, and the man himself, who began a string of shrill threats. "I'm going to call the police! I'll see you in jail!" he shrieked as he clutched his shattered nose. "Jesus, Sean," Colin said. "Why did you do that?" Sean set his empty beer bottle down on the railing, then took Colin's face in both his hands. He pulled Colin close until their foreheads were almost touching, and for a moment looked dead sober. "I did it because he was trying to hurt you. He was trying to hurt your future. You are the best of us, Colin, and you have a real chance to get out of here, and I couldn't let him ruin it." As suddenly as Sean's sobriety appeared, it fled when he pulled another beer bottle from his pocket and twisted the top off. "I love you, Colin," he said, and he walked back into the house. "I love you too," Colin said to his back. "Now, what do you think, Colin?" James said, his voice still low and even as he squeezed Colin's upraised arm. "Is this what Sean would want for you?" Some things need doing, Colin said, not taking his eyes off the blubbering face of Tim Canyon. He yanked his arm free from James's grip and cocked it back again when he felt a breeze touch the side of his face and heard a single, whispered word in his ear. No. He snapped his head up, taking his eyes off Tim, and looked back at his friends. They were all watching him intently and gave no indication they'd spoken or heard anything. Colin looked around, lowering his arm. Ahead of him, down the street, he saw a bulky, broad-shouldered figure pass through the light of another street lamp. He narrowed his eyes and peered into the darkness beyond the distant circle of light, but there was nothing more. Letting his arm fall to his side, Colin shook his head. He glanced back at James and down at Tim. No, you're right. Sean would not want this. With a shove, he released Tim and stood upright. My friend is lying in his cold coffin, and it's your fault. Can you live with that? Pulling his knees to his chest, Tim buried his face in his hands. I don't know, he whimpered. Figure out how, Colin said. I've got a lot of things I have to learn to live with, but I won't live with this. He turned from Tim's quivering form and was grateful when he felt James's heavy arms settle across his shoulders. This is the right thing, James said, while Mason and Matthew nodded in agreement and fell in step behind them. It's a long way from right, Colin said. But it's what Sean would want me to do. The end. I really enjoyed writing that story. It's one of my personal favorites, and I really hope you guys enjoyed it as well. And once again, as always, thanks for being here with me.